Good afternoon. When I first presented this information to Chopticon, it went about 45 minutes. And my professional colleagues are very good. They worked with me, they critiqued my performance, and it will not take 45 minutes today. At the end of this presentation, I'm going to make sure that Ms. Bachner has a copy of the PowerPoint. And if you then want to go through the PowerPoint, if there's a slide or something, you have questions, you can email me, you can speak with Ms. Bachner, you can talk to Ms. Dawn Pipkin to get clarification. So I'm going to go through a lot of these slides fairly quickly because you're a fairly sophisticated group and I know that you've been involved in a lot of the conversations. So first of all, you are one of the 5 pilot schools, which you are well aware of. You represent the middle school. We did not do all 4, we just did you, so your voice, as Ms. Dutterer did refer to, is incredibly important because you represent Esperanza, Margaret Brent, and Spring Ridge. We started this year in the fall of 2011, and we came out to the schools. We did 2 different sessions where we gathered information from you. We talked about the data that's available and how that could be applied appropriately, effectively, fairly across all the different teachers at all the different levels. And you really came up with 4 very specific things. The first thing that everybody seemed to be telling us was teachers can reach students if they're in front of them. So whatever we do, the students who are habitually truant or who float in and out of a classroom, there has to be some way for accounting for that. The next is teachers want recognition for student growth. Because a lot of times kids come here and you grow them all the way to here, but unfortunately the bar might be here. So we want to make sure that we recognize that incredible effort even if you don't meet the AMO or the AYP goal. The next is that everybody's different. We have to design a tool that works for reading, language arts, and math teachers, which everybody seems to run on board because that's the data that we have for grades 3 through 8. But it also has to work for social studies and science and the unified arts and all the host of people who interact every day with kids. So it has to be different because you teach different things, and we have to figure out some way to gather relevant data that's appropriate for each. And then the last is it has to be a whole bunch of stuff. It can't just be one test, because that is not an appropriate measure. Now, of course, that is the state model, and of course, that is the national model, but that's not the model we're going to use here. We want to make sure that we have a whole bunch of different data points that represent different student learning. So those are the 4 very common themes that came out of the meetings that we had at the beginning of the school year. Now, you know that we started, and we kind of shared this at the beginning, this was the very first thing in the race to the top that said half of all teacher evaluation is going to be based on professional practice, which means classroom observations, the things that we've traditionally been doing for the last 20 years here, the last 12 years with Charlotte Danielson, and then 50% is based on student learning. And the student learning, when they first came out with it, they said very specifically that of that 50%, 30 has to be directly tied to a state assessment or a state measure. And that 20%, then the local educational agencies, the LEAs, the counties, they had the flexibility to determine what that is. So that was the first thing that they told us. Now, we said, okay, well, if that's going to be the breakdown, we're going to look at 5 different pots of data. We know that we collect data, we get data from the state for summative assessments, MSA, HSA scores. We have formative assessment data, the data that's in our Performance Matters warehouse for all of our county-created benchmarks. We know that we are working on performance assessments. We've been talking a lot about performance assessments. Your educational summer academies, one of the things that we're supposed to be doing is taking a look at the Common Core and having it reflected in performance assessments. We know that we talk a lot about student growth, and we need to recognize student growth when we're talking about teacher evaluation. And then finally, we knew that we have a lot of stuff on student classroom performance, and particularly in that we're talking about the classwork that kids do every single day, their grades. So we said, when we look at those things, that meets their criteria. 30% of it is directly aligned to a state standard, either the state test itself or the county-created benchmarks. All county-created benchmarks are articulated back to a state standard and assessment limit. And we know that locally we can set growth targets. We can talk about where we want kids to start and where we want them to end. And we know that we have a lot of data on classroom performance. We've talked a lot about classroom performance and grades and the things that we ask kids to do. So we knew that we pretty much had aligned ourselves with what they expected. And when we came out and talked to you in the fall, this is really about as fleshed out as we had gotten. We had talked about how these different elements could be captured in an annual evaluation. So to finalize all of it, if we were to add domain 5 on the top of our other 4 domains that we have, we would end up with 5 domains, 26 different components underneath there, and underneath the 26 components, 96 elements. A lot of individual points. So what I want everybody to walk away from this is that's a lot of measurement. That's a lot of stuff. So any one thing can't be the determining factor. If you have all of it spread out and take a look at all the different things that teachers do, no one thing is going to over impact a particular teacher's evaluation. And that's what we were going for. We want a reflective look at what teachers are doing every single year. So we've spent a lot of time with the pilot committee, the steering committee, the group that is represented in your building by Mrs. Bachner and by Ms. Dawn Pipkin back there, and Ms. Wanda Twig is representing you as the association representative, and we have Ms. Kelly Hall, who's representing the elementary schools, and we have Mr. Jeff Marr, who's representing all of the supervisors in teaching and learning and all that assessment. So we've had a lot of conversations this year. We have Brian Rose here, right? Brian Rose is here. So we've had a lot of conversations this year. So once you decide you want to have the 5 buckets, okay, then we wanted to be very specific about what kind of data we're going to put into each one of these buckets. And what we said was it can't just be a simple number. You can't just go, all right, hey, the state said 87%. All right, we put 87% in there. We don't have a system like that. What we want to do is we want to have very specific data that we put in there. So we took our 5 buckets and then we divided, because that's how Danielson is laid out. We have a domain, we have a component. Underneath the components, we have elements. So underneath each element, we have overall student performance, and then we have evidence of support and intervention. We also have some other parts that were in other sections of Danielson that better align themselves, talking about student performance. Alignment with instructional goals, criteria and standards, design and implementation of formative assessments, utilizing a variety of assessment instruments, timely and effective communication with parents, clear and consistent assessment plan. All of those elements actually reside already in TPAS, and so we didn't want to have them redundantly reflected in Domain 5, so we pulled them out of TPAS and we put them in Domain 5. And we're still working on where each one of them might fit, but we do believe that that falls into evidentiary elements. So those are all the domain, the component, the elements, and then each one of them would receive a rating of either ineffective, developing, effective, or highly effective. So what we've spent the time in the last couple of months is, how are we going to get that data? And what is that data going to look like for each individual teacher? Well, the first is lagging data, and we have a lot of lagging data for students. We have stuff that comes from the state, we have stuff that we collect in-house, but we have lagging data. And what we'll do for a lot of this is we're going to wait and see what the state gives us. Okay, we're going to wait for state reports. We've seen some examples, and then they pulled them back, and they did some more, and then they pushed them out again. We're going to wait for the state. So that means that if you have a state assessment directly related to your content area, which means you're either reading language arts or you're English, or you're directly supporting reading language arts or English, there will be a state measure that is included in your annual Domain 5 evaluation. If you are not somebody who has a state science as well, pardon me, science, you have science in 8th grade. If you are not represented and don't have a state assessment, then we just pull that out. And we take the other 2 pieces, and instead of making them worth 10%, they're worth 15%. Okay? So the first is we have summative assessments. Next, we have formative assessments. You guys are very high-end technical users of Performance Matters. I know we reviewed your data, you're logging on, you're looking at it, you're drilling down, you're using it to inform instruction. And so we're going to be working with our vendor to make sure that we have really good reports, tailored reports that are easy to use and are accessible to teachers, so that all you have to do is log into Performance Matters, click a couple of buttons, and you'll see how you're doing in real time relative to formative assessments. And I know that doesn't exist now. We are working on it. Performance assessments. This is exciting stuff. I know that you guys have been working on this with supervisors and with the Summer Effectiveness Educator Effectiveness Academies, and we're talking about how we're going to roll out the Common Core. I know you've been doing some collaborative work on that. All of you probably have a performance assessment in your classroom. Now, you might not call it a performance assessment. You might call it a lab. You might call it a paper. You might call it a presentation. But it's an opportunity for kids to take all the stuff that they've learned and synthesize it into something. So all it is for next year, we're going to make sure that we figure out a way to capture that data easily, either extracting it out of your grade book or putting it in Performance Matters as it's assessed. Student growth, we're going to look to the state to see what they give us. We're also going to work with us. We know that you guys do a lot of work at the end of the year. Right now, after you get past MSA, you're going to take a lot of looking at where kids are and where they need to go. And that's the kind of work that will begin next year. Where kids enter through pre-assessment, where we expect them to end through some kind of post-assessment. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And then the last is classroom performance. We've done a whole host of reports, and you'll be seeing some of them. Moving away from just the how many A's, B's, C's, D's, and F's, instead looking at how kids are doing in your class compared to like kids in other classes. So we're not talking about what your grade distribution is necessarily. I know that is a conversation that everybody has, but this is specifically kind of drilling into the grade book to seeing if the kids in your class are performing like similar kids in another class. And more importantly, is there even distribution across categories, meaning that your process grades where kids are learning equal your product grades where they're showing you what they've learned to overall, when you average them together, your overall average. Because if there's a great disparity between that, that's something we probably need to talk about. So all of the Domain 5 has, each one of the components is divided into two different elements. And the first element says, how did the kids do? And the second element says, how did you support that? So that if your kids maybe didn't meet the measured mark, maybe struggled a bit, if you can show, I'm sorry, that child never showed up. When they showed up, they weren't prepared. I had 3 parent meetings. I worked with that child. I stayed after. The second element, rating element, is evidence of support and intervention. How can you show that you directly impacted that child and tried everything you possibly could to get them where they needed to be? So every single one of those has that balance. The next is to really talk about how are we going to set performance targets, because even the state, we applied for a waiver. We're hoping that we're going to get the waiver. Probably we're going to get the waiver, which means that they're going to take back their AYP measures, and then we're going to have to put some new measures in place because you have to have goals. So how do you get a goal? If I'm teaching a PE class, I haven't necessarily had an annual goal. I work with my content and my supervisor, and I work with other people in the building and in leadership, and I contribute to and am part of an instructional team, but maybe I don't have a personal targeted goal. So what will happen next year, and the really exciting work that hopefully you all are going to volunteer for, and I'm hopeful, in April, after spring break, after we take a little time away from the kids we love so much, and for all of those who directly work with my child and have worked with my other child, thank you, dear God, for your patience. If he makes it through to the end of the week with you and with me, it'll be an Easter miracle. So how are we going to do this really important work? And we're going to do two things. We want to talk about attributed students. So we want to figure out which kids we're going to look at. Because if you are a unified arts teacher in middle school and you've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kids, to look at hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kids, that's not going to be meaningful. Okay? So instead what we want to do is we want to figure out the attributed students. So at the beginning of the year, we all decide what kids we want to look at, because either they come in at risk or because there's a particular element. But we're going to look at these kids because this is meaningful. So you figure your attributed students first, and then the other is you set performance targets based on the data that we've had in the past or the data that we anticipate generating this year. But we look at those attributed students and performance targets. And that is directed by you, the classroom teacher, and your relationship with your evaluator. So at the beginning of the year, you're really going to have a concrete opportunity to set examples. So You work with your building principal, you take a look at all the data that the kids come in, you decide what kind of complexity, you talk about the complexity factors of the classroom, and ultimately you define a cohort, an attributed student group. And then working with our vendor, we're going to, you'll be able to mark those kids at the beginning of the year, and those will be the kids that we track. The next is you're going to set performance targets, and what our job is at central office, or more importantly, or more specifically, Jeff Marr's job is at central office, is to take a look at all the data that we've collected over the multiple years and see what we can put together for you. So we can say, historically, kids in 7th grade, reading language arts on grade level have done this. So that we can say, based on what we've done and where we are, what do we think would be an appropriate target? And then, this is all in your sheets. We have to put together a process. And if the process sounds kind of familiar, it's because it's based off of the ideal process for formative, if you go on the formative cycle. And the formative cycle basically says that you take a look at all the things that you're doing, you figure out what kind of a professional development goal you want to set for yourself, you determine that goal, you go in and you sit down with your principal or evaluator and you say, this is what I'm going to work on this year, they sign off on it. You gather evidence throughout the entire year. Maybe midway through the year there's a little checkup, or maybe it goes all the way to the end of the year and then there it is. But this is the same process that we're going to follow, except it's going to be very data-driven based on the data that we currently have. So you begin, we set targets, we take a look at your kids, you determine your attributed student group, you talk about your student learning objective. Wow, what is the student learning objective? Hey, look, Mr. Smith, it's a new thing. It's a new word, and everybody loves words. It's a new term. Everybody's in love with this new thing, the SLO. You're going to hear it all across the eastern seaboard. The Colorado model is based on SLOs. New York, Engaged New York is SLOs. Up in New Hampshire and Maine, SLOs. And in the state of Maryland, SLOs. And what does it mean? You've got your definition. I think it's in there someplace. It basically says that you need to set a goal, and your goal needs to be set on something that's measurable and appropriate to your content and reflective of the work that you do. And at the end of the year, you should be able to have a cogent conversation about whether or not the kids met your goal. So, there's a million different forms we've gone through. We started with this form, then we went to this form, and then we went to this form, and then we brought it to the council, and the council said, not that form, and then we talked about this form, and then we argued back and forth, we threw things, we jumped up and down. Where you all come into it is after spring break, we need you to all kind of test drive the form. We all want you to sit down with us, and we're going to compensate you, by the way, so it's compensated volunteer work, and it's heady money. It's $23 an hour for 2 hours, but that is enough for dinner at Salsa's with a drink, an adult drink. So we've got a form that we want to fill out, and now before you guys sit down to do the form, we're gonna do our part, and we're going to try to give you as much historical data that we have, so you can kind of go, well, that's historically how kids have done on this. And what you're going to be doing is you're going to talk about considering this year. What attributed students would you like to use? What student group, and maybe all of your kids, or maybe a small group of kids, or maybe you're a push-in special educator and you want to really, but attributed students. The learning content, because many of you teach multiple things in multiple levels. So let's have it really targeted. You can't, if you teach 3 different levels of kids and you have one target, that's not really appropriate. Not to in any way diminish the state of Maryland and how they set it up. But it has to be specific. So you have to identify the learning content, and the interval for us is going to be all year, and that's what we have. And then we're really looking at three of the buckets. We're setting targets for 3 of the buckets. The first bucket, the summative assessment, the state's going to give us what they're going to give us, and we're going to work with it. And the 5th bucket, grades, we got a lot of different ways we can look at grades, and you are all well versed in that, so that's not a challenge. But the 3 buckets in the middle are formative assessments, which means the stuff that's in performance matters. Performance assessment, that means the stuff that you do already, but you might not have called it performance assessment, or you're creating it through educator effectiveness that we're just going to have to work on for next year. And the last is student growth. Maybe your content does have a pre and post. Maybe you're lucky enough to be a reading language arts or a math teacher and they actually have those things with the science MSA 8th grade, although you can't really do pre and post because it's a one drop stop kind of a thing. But what we're going to want you to do is take a look at whatever data we have already, and we have data on the stuff that's in Performance Matters. That's pretty much the data that we have. And we want to hear from you as to what should go into that bucket. Really specific. The name of the test that should go into the bucket if it already exists in Performance Matters. Or if you have a test that you've designed with your team level or your group or across your content that's a really great assessment, if that needs to be included in there. What specifically you would use for a performance assessment based on what you already have. So hopefully you already have something that could be considered a performance assessment. We want you to let us know what that thing is, okay? And then finally, if you don't have a county created pre and post, what 2 measures would you use, or have you used, or would like to use, or would like to have developed to do that? So this is the part where you actually get in and start telling us what we need to put in there. And this is incredibly important because whatever you guys all decide needs to be put in there, it's then our job to figure out a way to have that happen easily, okay? Easily. So that it either happens automatically or it happens with as little input on your end as need be. So that you can continue to do the exact thing that you're doing right now, but we're going to be doing data gathering in the background, okay? So it's really important that everybody joins with us to identify the things that go in the buckets. And then the last is kind of a takeoff from the great work that you already did in the fall with Dawn and with Ms. Bachner, with Lisa. What are some of the complexity factors? Because now we're really down in the weeds. We're talking about different data points, okay? What do we need to consider about those data points that either make them valid or invalid, or we need to consider, what kind of things do we need to think about when we're talking about student performance in those classes? And then the last is the professional development part of it, the part that actually makes this perhaps useful and exciting is what are some of the strategies that you're going to use or are using to achieve a measurable difference with kids? Because at the end of the day, we'd like to think that this is a lot of work. We'd like to think that it's assistive to the system, to kids, to teachers, that it is professional development. So if we start to get some really common Domain 5 language and we have a teacher who has kids that are underperforming at one site, we can then pull the data from a teacher at another site. We can look at what strategies they're using, and maybe their strategies are different than this other teacher's strategies, and so there's a great opportunity there. So we've already got the online TPAS system. It has observations, it has artifacts, it has evidence of student learning. You have observations. How many people have actually gone on to TPAS and logged on as themselves as teachers and looked at the stuff that's in there? All right, good. Please do that. Please do that, because I will tell you that we found things that weren't right and up to date, and if everybody does that, then I can feel confident that what's in there is right. All eyes on. So at the end of it, Domain 5 is going to be the same kind of a thing, okay? It's not going to be a whole, it's going to look like the rest of TPAS does, where you have a domain, you have components, you have elements, you have ratings, and then you have a narrative. So all of this data gathering and all the stuff that's going on, that's really important, and that drives our work, and that tells us how kids are doing and what we need to do. But when we get to the actual observation and evaluation, it's going to be just the same process that we've always done. A drop-down rating, ineffective, developing, highly effective, or what they call it in New York, the Heidi scale. Highly effective, developing, ineffective. The Heidi scale. And then we'll stick it all in there. It'll go through the calculation engine, and that's how you get your evaluation, okay? But data-driven on the back end. So you can have up to 4 observations. You can have as many artifacts as you have to get your professional practice 50%. Your Domain 5 is student growth, and each one of those 5 buckets, and you have direct input into what goes into those buckets. It all goes together to give an overall rating. And keep in mind that at the end of all of this work, okay, 96 different elements and 4 different ratings and multiple, probably 400 or 500 different points. At the end of it, your evaluation is going to be, ineffective, developing, effective, or highly effective. And the state is saying all they want to know is ineffective, and effective, and highly effective. So it's a lot of effort to get to this point. So the question is, and look, it'll all come together, and wait, here's the pretty, oh, look, it's all blended, because they're all kind of interrelated. You might say to yourself, I don't want to do this, Scott. You're insane. That's just nuts. Whatever. No, I'm not going to do it. Okay, well, the state realizes that some people won't come up with their own plan. And so they're going to have the state default model. And they've just recently put out what that default model will look like, and they included it in the waiver application to the U.S. Department of Education, which means that if the U.S. Department of Education approves the waiver, they will be approving the default state model, which kind of then says the default state model is really going to be what they've said it's going to be. And it's not as though we're trying to keep this a secret. We didn't know about this until very recently, and it hasn't been formally presented really to any consistent stakeholder group. And what it says is that the teacher evaluation model, half of it will be professional practice, and that's going to be the Charlotte Danielson, yay, we're good to go. And then half of it's going to be based on student growth. And they're defining student growth as, for middle school, one content area, 20% will be your reading MSA class, and I don't know how they're going to get that measure. I guess I don't know what that measure is going to look like. I don't know because they haven't told us. 20% is going to be on student learning objectives, and the state hasn't defined exactly how they're going to do that. We're ahead of the state. And 10% is going to be based on a school index. And I'll show you how that's going to be calculated. That's pretty entertaining. And if you don't have a core content area, then they default back to the SLOs. Now, that's for the high school. Let's see if I can actually see how well I'm proficient with technology. Eesh. The student, if you can see, they're coming out with a new measure for school indexing. Instead of, so I don't know if this is going to be a version of AYP or what it's going to do, but they're going to take a school index, and 30% is going to be based on how kids do on math, reading, and science. 40% is going to be based on gap between your lowest subgroup and your highest subgroup for math, reading, or science, which means that if you're in a school that serves a very advanced group of kids and at the same time also struggling learners, there's going to be quite a gap, and that's going to be 40% of the school index. So the good news is try to shoot for a school that goes into the meaty middle, or there everybody's, you wouldn't want to have a diverse school. I guess that's what the state's saying. And then 30% is going to be based on growth for MSA reading and MSA math. And they haven't really talked about how they're going to determine growth, but we've seen the models that they've had so far. We poked a whole bunch of holes in it, and then they brought it back to MSDE. But so they're going to try to calculate this next year. I haven't seen any, they haven't given us anything as far as like what this will look like. But in the state default model, at least 10% of your overall evaluation will be based on that, whether you have any direct input in reading, math, or science at all. And 40% based on gaps between the lowest and the highest subgroups. I don't agree with any of it. I don't know how it's ever going to make anybody a better teacher. That's not going to make anybody a better teacher. We're hoping that what we're proposing and what we worked on all of this year is something that will actually help everybody, first of all, be recognized for the incredible work that you're doing with kids. And then second of all, help those people who aren't having that same level of success as you. So with that, that's the end of the presentation. How am I doing on time? Anybody time me? Nobody time me? About a half an hour. So I'm within the window. Okay. At this point, 25. Oh, sweet. Is there anything that anybody would like to contribute from the pilot group? Anybody? Anything I missed? Last chance. Miss Pipkin, last chance.
It's just been a lot of work, so I hope you see the differences between the two. and that we're really trying to, especially when you think about Unified Arts folks, that we're really trying to make our model about what you teach and how you impact kids.
And we remain your faithful servant ever, and it is our job to put together data systems that actually can give you this stuff without killing you. We want to have something that runs in the background and it's fairly seamless. So we're spending a lot of time with vendors, and we will spend a lot more time with vendors. And once you guys all volunteer in April, and I don't have that date because there's actually a conflict. So I think there's a conflict on April 23rd because that's the edge. That's the. Okay. Okay. All right. Excellent. We really need you. We really need everybody to come back in and try to populate the form and say what kind of data you'd like to have in there. Because that's really important for us, because depending upon what you say you want in that data, then we have to go back and figure out how to get it in there without causing great consternation across all people. So how many people by show of hands would like to make a pre-commitment to volunteer? How many? I'm all on, that's what I figured. Okay, well, after spring break, after you've been away from us for a week, you'll miss us. And the whole point, yay! And the whole point is we're gonna be here for you, and we're gonna compensate you. I know it's a pittance, but we're all about. $46 is better than nothing, and then after taxes, it's like 20. So.
And the teachers on the pilot committee are all doing that form across several different contents. So you'll have an example in a content that's just like yours to see to go through the process, and we'll be here to help you through that process, all of us.
And the more you give us, the more we're able to build something that's going to meet everybody's needs. Okay? And with that, you've been just fantastic, and have a lovely day, and see ya.